Robert Harrison sat in the back seat of his black luxury car and checked his watch for the third time that evening. It was almost 9 at night, and the city streets were mostly empty now. His driver pulled up to the tall glass building that housed Harrison Industries, and Robert gathered his briefcase. He had forgotten some important papers in his office, and tomorrow morning there was a crucial meeting with investors from overseas. The building looked different at night. During the day it was always buzzing with hundreds of employees rushing around and phones ringing and meetings happening in every corner. But now it stood quiet and still, with only a few lights glowing from the upper floors. Robert stepped out of the car and told his driver to wait. He walked through the main entrance and nodded at the security guard, who looked surprised to see the boss at this hour. Elevator ride to the top floor felt longer than usual in the silence. Robert had built this company from nothing. Over the past 25 years, he started with just a small office and one assistant, and now he employed over 5,000 people. But lately he had been thinking a lot about what really mattered in life. Success and money were good, but they did not tell you much about a person's real character. He had met plenty of people who smiled at him and acted respectful only because of his wealth and position. It made him wonder sometimes who would treat him well if he was just an ordinary person. With no power or money, the elevator doors opened, and Robert stepped onto the executive floor. His office was at the end of the long hallway, and he started walking toward odd. The floors were so polished he could almost see his reflection in them. Someone did a good job keeping this place clean every single night. As he got closer to his office, he heard voices, not loud ones, but the quiet kind of talking that people do when they are trying not to disturb anyone. Robert slowed his steps and listened. It was coming from the waiting area just outside his office. He recognized one of the voices. It belonged to Carlos Rivera, who had been the night janitor at Harrison Industries for many years now. Robert had always noticed that Carlos did excellent work and never caused any problems. The man was quiet and hardworking and always had a polite smile when they passed each other in the hallways. But tonight there was another voice, a younger one. Robert moved closer and peeked around the corner. Carlos was there with his cleaning cart, and next to him was a teenage boy who looked about 16 or 17 years old. The boy had the same dark hair and kind eyes as Carlos. This must be his son. Robert had heard that Carlos was raising his boy alone. After his wife had passed away several years ago, the two of them were working together and organizing cleaning supplies and talking softly to each other. Stood there for a moment, and then an idea came to him. What if he could see what these two people were really like when they thought no one important was watching? He had learned over the years that you discover the truth about people not by what they say, but by what they do when they think it does not matter. Walked into the waiting area and sat down on the large leather couch. He loosened his tie a bit and leaned back against the cushions. Then he closed his eyes and let his body relax as if he had fallen asleep right there. His briefcase sat on the floor next to the couch. Through his barely open eyelids, Robert could still see what was happening in the room here. Controlled his breathing to make it slow and steady, like someone who was really sleeping. A few minutes passed. Then he heard the sound of the cleaning cart wheels getting closer. The cart stopped. Suddenly there was silence, and then he heard Carlos whisper something. The boy whispered back. Their voices were so quiet that Robert had to focus carefully to hear the words. Carlos was telling his son that they should clean this area last. He said the man sleeping on the couch was Mr. Harrison, who owned the whole company. They should let him rest and not disturb him. Robert felt curious about how the boy would react. Would he be excited to see a billionaire up close? Would he'd want to take a photo or tell his friends? Would he treat it like some kind of big deal? But what happened next surprised Robert. The boy, whose name he learned was David, did not seem interested in staring at him or making a fuss. Instead, David walked over quietly and looked up at the air conditioning vent on the ceiling. He noticed that the cold air was blowing directly down onto the couch where Robert was lying. Without saying a word, David went to the wall and adjusted the air conditioning controls. He turned the vent so the air would flow in a different direction and not blow right on top of someone trying to sleep. Then David came back to his father and whispered that they should clean the other offices first and come back to this area later. That way, Mr. Harrison could sleep without hearing vacuum cleaners and smelling cleaning products, Carlos?" Nodded and smiled at his son with obvious pride. The two of them pushed their cart down the hallway toward the other offices. Lay there on the couch feeling genuinely surprised. This teenager had just shown more thoughtfulness and consideration than many of the executives. Robert dealt with every day the boy could have ignored a sleeping stranger, or even been annoyed that someone was in the way of his work, but instead he had gone out of his way to make sure Robert would be comfortable for the next 40 minutes. Robert stayed on that couch with his eyes mostly closed. He could hear David and Carlos working in the nearby offices. They moved efficiently and talked to each other in quiet voices. Sometimes Robert could hear them joking about something and laughing softly. There was warmth between them and respect to the kind of relationship that does not happen by accident, but gets built over years of trust and love. Eventually they came back to the waiting area. Robert kept his breathing slow and even. He heard the vacuum cleaner start up, but it was on the lowest setting, and David was pushing it very carefully across the carpet. The boy worked around the couch where Robert lay and made sure not to bump into it when David got close to the side table near Robert. He stopped the vacuum. Robert could sense the boy standing nearby through his eyelashes. He watched David reach out and pick up a pen that had rolled near the edge of the table. The boy put it back in the pen holder so it would not fall. Then David noticed something else. Robert's briefcase had tipped over slightly, and the flap had come open. Some papers were starting to slide out. These were not just any papers. Robert knew exactly what was in that briefcase. There were contracts worth millions of dollars and confidential business plans and financial documents that competitors would pay a fortune to see. David bent down and looked at the briefcase for a moment. He paused. Robert felt his heart beat a little faster. What would the boy do? This was the real test. David carefully gathered the loose papers and straightened them. He did not read them or look through them with curiosity. He simply organized them neatly and tucked them back into the briefcase. Then he closed the flap securely and stood the briefcase upright against the couch so it would not tip over again. The whole thing took maybe 30 seconds. David did it naturally, like it was the obvious thing to do, and then went back to vacuuming. Robert felt something shift inside his chest. In his world, people were always trying to get an advantage or find an angle or take something that was not theirs, but this teenage boy had just protected Robert's property without even thinking about it. There was no one around to praise him for it, no reward waiting. No one would have even known if David had taken those papers or looked through them, but the boy had done the right thing simply because it was right. When the vacuuming was done, Carlos came back with a trash bag. Father and son worked together to empty the small wastebaskets and wipe down the tables. They moved like a team that had done this many times before. Then Robert heard them talking again. Carlos said something that made Robert's throat tighten. The father was apologizing to David. He said he was sorry that David had to miss his school awards ceremony that evening. David had won some kind of academic achievement award, and there had been a special ceremony at school to present it, but Carlos needed to work overtime tonight because they needed the extra money. The overtime pay was too important to pass up, so David had come here to help his father finish faster instead of going to his own ceremony. Robert expected to hear disappointment or resentment in the boy's voice. What teenager wants to miss his own award ceremony to clean office buildings? But David's response was not what Robert anticipated. The boy told his father not to worry about it at all. He said the ceremony was just people clapping and taking photos. Real achievement was the learning itself and the work he had put in all year, David said. He would rather be here helping his dad than sitting in an auditorium. Besides, he added, they were a team and teams stick together. Carlos put his hand on his son's shoulder, and Robert could hear the emotion in the father's voice when he thanked David. He told his son that he was proud of him not just for the award but for being such a good person. David laughed a little and said he learned from the best. Then he said they should finish up and get home, because his dad had to be back here early in the morning. Robert lay on that couch and listened to them pack up their supplies. He heard the cartwheels squeak as they pushed it toward the elevator. He heard Carlos remind David to grab his backpack from the supply closet. He heard the elevator doors open and close. Then there was silence. Robert opened his eyes and sat up. He looked around the immaculate waiting area. Everything was spotless. Tables gleamed, and the carpet had perfect vacuum lines, and even the magazines were arranged neatly. But what struck Robert most was not the cleanliness, it was the character he had just witnessed. He stood up and walked over to where his briefcase sat next to it on the table. He noticed something. It was a small piece of paper torn from a cleaning checklist written on it, in simple handwriting, were the words, "Found your papers coming out of your bag and did not want you to lose anything important." It was signed with just the initials Dard David Rivera. Rivera picked up the note and stared at it for a long moment. His entire career he had hired countless people. He had worked with graduates from the best universities. In business schools, he had partnered with people who had impressive resumes and powerful connections. But here was a teenage boy who had never set foot in a boardroom and who spent his evenings mopping floors, and this boy had just demonstrated more integrity and thoughtfulness than Robert had seen in months. So Robert folded the note carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. His mind was already racing with possibilities. He had come here tonight just to pick up some forgotten papers, but instead, he had discovered something far more valuable. He had found exactly the kind of person the world needed, more of the kind of person his company needed, the kind of person he wished more young people would aspire to be. Robert gathered his briefcase and headed back to the elevator. He made a decision. He was not going to let this moment pass. He was not going to just forget about David Rivera and go back to his regular life tomorrow. He would make some phone calls, he would do some research, and he would figure out how to turn this chance encounter into something meaningful, because Robert Harrison had not become successful by ignoring opportunities when they appeared, and David Rivera was an opportunity not for Robert to exploit, but for Robert to invest in the kind of investment that actually mattered. Robert smiled to himself as he stepped into the elevator. Sometimes the universe puts exactly the right person in front of you at exactly the right time. You just have to be paying attention. And tonight, Robert had been paying very close attention. Indeed, Robert arrived at his office early the next morning with a purpose. He had barely slept because his mind kept replaying what he had witnessed the night before. The night before, that young man, David, and his father, Carlos, had shown him something rare in this world. Real goodness. The kind that exists whether anyone is watching or no. Sat down at his massive desk and pressed the button on his phone that connected him to Linda Peterson, who ran the Human Resources Department. She answered on the second ring and sounded surprised to hear from him so early. Robert asked her to come to his office right away and to bring the employment file for Carlos. Reverend Linda arrived 15 minutes later carrying a thin folder. She seemed nervous, like most people did when the boss called them in. Without explanation, Robert gestured for her to sit down and opened the folder. He found inside made him pause. Carlos Rivera had been with Harrison Industries for 12 years, 12 years of perfect attendance, not a single day missed, not for illness or vacation or personal reasons. Man had shown up every single night for over a decade. His performance reviews were all excellent. Multiple supervisors had noted that Carlos took pride in his work and often went beyond what was required. He had never filed a complaint or caused any problems. He was simply there every night doing his job with quiet dedication. Takata looked up at Linda and asked if she knew anything about Carlos beyond what was in the file. Linda thought for a moment and then remembered something. She said that a few years ago, one of the other janitors had mentioned that Carlos was raising his son alone. His wife had died when the boy was young. Carlos had never remarried and had focused entirely on providing for his son and giving him a good life. Robert asked if there was any information about the son. Linda shook her head. Employee family members were not really tracked unless they were also employed by the company, but she could make some calls and find out more if Robert needed that information. Told her to do exactly that. He wanted to know everything about David Rivera, what school he attended, and what his grades were like, and what his plans were for the future. Linda looked confused, but nodded. She had worked for Robert long enough to know that when he got interested in something, he had good reasons. She said she would have the information by the end of the day. After Linda left, Robert sat back in his chair and looked out the window at the city below. His building stood among dozens of other tall structures, and down there somewhere were millions of people, all of them trying to make a living and take care of their families and get through each day. How many of them were like Carlos and David? Good people who worked hard and did the right thing even when it was difficult. And how many of those people ever got a real chance to show what they were? Capable of Robert had grown up poor himself. His father had worked in a factory and his mother had cleaned houses to make extra money. He remembered what it felt like to wear secondhand clothes and to worry about whether there would be enough food. At the end of the month, he remembered his parents teaching him that character mattered more than money, that how you treated people said everything about who you really were somewhere along the way, as Robert had built his fortune. Those lessons had gotten buried under layers of business deals and corporate strategy, but last night had reminded him, David Rivera had reminded him by 6 that evening. Linda was back in his office with a detailed report. She had called the school and spoke with David's guidance counselor and even tracked down a few teachers. What she learned was remarkable. David Rivera was 17 years old and a senior at Lincoln High School. Was ranked 3rd in his entire class academically. He had a straight A average and had taken every advanced course the school offered. His teachers all said the same things about him. He was respectful and hardworking, and always willing to help other students who were struggling. He never caused trouble and never made excuses. Guidance counselor mentioned that David had been accepted to 3 different universities. 1 was the state university and 2 were private colleges that had offered him partial scholarships, but David had not committed to any of them yet. When the counselor asked why David had said he was still figuring out the financial side of things, Linda had done some math based on the scholarship offers and the cost of attendance 7 with the scholarships. David would need about $20,000 per year to cover tuition and books and housing. Carlos made $32,000 annually as a night janitor after taxes and basic living expenses. There was no way he could afford to send his son to college, not without taking on massive debt. David probably knew this. He was probably trying to figure out if he should take a gap year and work full-time to save money, or maybe he was considering going to community college first. Even though he was clearly capable of much more, Robert closed the folder and thanked Linda after she left. He sat alone in his office as the sun set over the city. He thought about what $20,000 meant to him versus what it meant to Carlos Rivera. For Robert, it was barely noticeable. He spent more than that on business dinners and travel in a typical month, but for Carlos and David, it was the difference between opportunity and limitation. It was the difference between David reaching his full potential or having to settle for less than he deserved. Had always believed that talent was distributed equally across society, but opportunity was not. Here was living proof. Brilliant young man who had done everything right, worked hard and studied and stayed out of trouble and helped his father in despite all of that. He was probably going to have to compromise his future because of money. It did not sit right with Robert, not at all. Over the next few days, Robert found himself thinking about David constantly. He made discreet inquiries and learned more details. He found out that David wanted to study engineering specifically. He was interested in sustainable architecture and creating affordable housing solutions. Robert read that he actually laughed out loud in his empty office. This kid who had grown up with nothing wanted to dedicate his life to helping other people who had nothing. Most teenagers were thinking about video games and social media. David Rivera was thinking about how to solve homelessness. Robert decided he needed to see them again, not as the sleeping boss on a couch, but as himself. He wanted to talk to David and Carlos's face to face. He wanted to understand them better. So he arranged to work late one evening and made sure he would be in his office when the night cleaning crew arrived at around 8:30. Robert was sitting at his desk reviewing contracts when he heard the familiar sound of a cleaning cart in the hallway. He stood up and opened his door. Carlos was there with David beside him. Both of them looked surprised to see the big boss still working at this hour. Aribert smiled and greeted them warmly. He introduced himself properly and shook hands with both Carlos and David. Carlos seemed nervous and kept apologizing for interrupting. Robert told him there was nothing to apologize for and asked if they had a few minutes to talk. He could see the confusion on their faces, but they agreed. Robert invited them into his office and offered them seats on the comfortable couch near the window. He sat in a chair across from them and tried to make the atmosphere as relaxed as possible. He started by thanking Carlos for his many years of dedicated service to the company. Carlos looked humble and said he was just doing his job. Robert disagreed. He said that doing your job the way Carlos did it for 12 straight years without missing a single day was extraordinary. Then Robert turned to David. He asked the young man about school and what he was interested in studying. David answered politely and talked about his passion for engineering and architecture. His eyes lit up when he described his ideas for creating better housing that regular working families could actually afford. Robert listened carefully and asked thoughtful questions. He was impressed by how much David had already researched and thought through. This was not some vague teenage dream. David had specific ideas about sustainable materials and efficient design and cost reduction. After about 20 minutes of conversation, Robert decided to be direct. He told them that he had actually been in the office late about a week ago. Had been lying on the couch in the waiting area. Both Carlos and David looked confused at first, then understanding dawned on David's face, and he turned slightly red. Robert smiled and said he had not actually been sleeping. Had been watching to see what kind of people they really were when they thought no one important was paying attention. Carlos looked worried, like he thought they might be in trouble, but Robert quickly reassured him. He said that what he witnessed that night was the most impressive thing he had seen in years. He told David that the thoughtfulness of adjusting the air conditioning and securing the briefcase and leaving that note showed remarkable character. He told Carlos that the relationship between father and son and the values clearly being passed down were beautiful to see. David looked down at his hands and seemed embarrassed by the praise. He mumbled that he had just done what anyone would. Robert shook his head firmly. He said that was not true at all. Most people would not do those things. Most people were too focused on themselves to notice if someone else might be uncomfortable. Most people would have at least glanced at confidential papers if they had the chance. Most people would have been resentful about missing their own award ceremony. But David was not most people. Robert let that sit in the air for a moment. Then he asked David directly what was holding him back from accepting one of his university offers. David glanced at his father and then back at Robert. Hay said honestly that money was the issue. Even with scholarships, it was still too expensive. He did not want his father to go into debt or work even more hours than he already did. Carlos started to protest and say he would figure it out somehow, but David just smiled sadly and said they both knew the math did not work. Robert nodded slowly. He said he understood. Then he asked David a hypothetical question. If money was not an obstacle at all, what would David do? Where would he go, and what would he study? David thought about it. Said he would probably go to the state university. They had an excellent engineering program, and it was close enough that he could still help his father on weekends. Robert asked what David hoped to do after graduating. David's answer was immediate. He wanted to start a company or join an organization focused on creating housing solutions for low-income families. He talked about how many people worked full-time jobs but still could not afford decent places to live. He wanted to change that. He wanted to prove that good housing did not have to be expensive if you were smart about design and materials. Robert listened to this 17-year-old talk with such passion and clarity about making the world better, and he made his decision right there. He told David and Carlos that he wanted to make them an offer. The Harrison Foundation, which was Robert's charitable organization, would provide David with a full scholarship. It would cover tuition and books and housing and even a stipend for living expenses. Everything. David would not have to worry about money at all. He could focus completely on his education. There was silence in the office. David and Carlos both stared at Robert like they could not believe what they had just heard. Carlos found his voice first and asked if this was some kind of joke. Robert assured him it was completely serious, but there was one condition. David had to promise two things. First, he had to maintain his academic performance, and his character second. Once he became successful, he had to help others. The way he was being helped, he had to pass it forward. David's eyes filled with tears. He tried to speak but could not get words out. Carlos had his hand over his mouth and was also crying. After a moment, David managed to ask why would Robert do this for them? Robert leaned forward and spoke honestly. He said that in his life he had met thousands of people, rich people and poor people and everyone in between. He had learned that wealth does not create character. Character exists independent of money. David had something special, a combination of intelligence and integrity and compassion that was rare. Robert had built a successful company, but he had not built a perfect world. There were still too many barriers preventing good people from reaching their potential. He could not fix everything, but he could fix this one thing. He could give David the chance he deserved, and maybe David would go on to help hundreds or thousands of other families. maybe. David would become the kind of leader the world desperately needed that would be a better investment than anything Robert had ever put money into. Carlos stood up and shook Robert's hand with both of his. He kept saying thank you over and over. David also stood and shook Robert's hand. The young man looked him in the eye and said he would not let him down. Robert believed him completely. Before they left, Robert told them he would have his assistant contact them with all the details. He also mentioned that he hoped David might consider working part-time at Harrison Industries while he was in school, not cleaning floors, but actually working in the engineering and development department. It would give David real-world experience and expose him to the business side of construction and design. David agreed immediately as Carlos and David walked out of the office. Robert felt something he had not felt in years, pure satisfaction, not from closing a big deal or making a profit, from knowing he had just changed someone's life in a meaningful way. He stood at his window and watched the city lights somewhere out. There were probably dozens or hundreds of other young people like David, people with potential who just needed someone to believe in them and give them a chance. Robert decided this would not be a one-time thing. He would create a proper program through his foundation. A scholarship for children of Harrison Industries employees would focus not just on grades but on character and finding young people who demonstrated integrity and compassion and work ethic. People like David revered that night when Robert finally left his office and went home. He felt lighter than he had in months. He realized that pretending to sleep on that couch had been the most important business decision he had made in years. It had reminded him what really mattered him. It had introduced him to two people who had restored his faith in humanity: Carlos Rivera, who worked every night for 12 years without complaint to give his son a better life, and David Rivera, who helped his father with dignity and protected a stranger's briefcase and cared more about learning than ceremonies. These were the kind of people who made the world work, and Robert was grateful he had been paying attention enough to notice. 3 weeks had passed since that evening in Robert's office. David still sometimes woke up thinking the whole thing had been a dream, but then he would see the official letter from the Harrison Foundation sitting on his desk, and he would know it was real. All of it was real. The scholarship had been processed faster than anyone expected. Robert had personally made sure there was no delay or bureaucratic nonsense. Within 2 weeks, David had accepted his place at the state university and submitted all the necessary paperwork. The financial burden that had been crushing his family like a weight was suddenly gone, completely gone. David's first day of work at Harrison Industries was on a Saturday morning. He wore the only dress shirt he owned and a tie that his father had bought for him years ago. Carlos had helped him knot it properly and told him how proud he was. The security guard at the front entrance already knew who David was. Robert had made sure everyone in the building understood that David Rivera was not just some random intern. He was a scholarship recipient and a special guest of the company. David was to be treated with respect and given every opportunity to learn. Linda from Human Resources met David in the lobby and took him up to the engineering department on the 15th floor. The space was nothing like David had imagined. He had pictured cubicles and boring offices. Instead, it was an open floor plan with large tables covered in blueprints and architectural models. There were windows everywhere, letting in natural light. Engineers and designers worked in clusters and discussed projects and sketched ideas on whiteboards. Linda introduced David to Kenneth Walsh, who was the head of the engineering division. Kenneth was in his 50s, with gray hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He shook David's hand firmly and welcomed him to the team. Kenneth explained that David would be starting as an intern assistant, but this was not going to be a typical internship, where he just made copies and fetched coffee. Robert had specifically requested that David be given real work, meaningful projects where he could learn and contribute. For the first few weeks, David would shadow different engineers and learn how the department operated. After that, he would be assigned to an actual project team. David felt his heart racing with excitement. This was exactly the kind of opportunity he had dreamed about, but never thought he would get until after college. Kenneth walked David around the floor and introduced him to various team members. Everyone was friendly and welcoming. Several people mentioned that Robert himself had spoken highly of David, which made him feel both honored and nervous. What if he could not live up to those expectations? What if he disappointed everyone? Kenneth must have sensed David's anxiety because he put a hand on his shoulder and told him to relax. Nobody expected him to know everything. He was here to learn, though. Only thing they asked was that he work hard and ask questions and stay curious. David could do that. His first assignment was with a team designing a mixed-use development project downtown. It would combine retail spaces on the ground floor with residential apartments above. The challenge was making the apartments affordable for middle-class families, while still maintaining quality construction. David sat in on planning meetings and listened to engineers debate different approaches. He studied the blueprints and learned how to read the technical specifications. He asked questions constantly and took notes on everything. The lead engineer on the project was a woman named Patricia Chen, who had over 20 years of experience. She seemed to appreciate David's genuine interest and eagerness to understand. One afternoon, Patricia asked David what he thought about the current design for the residential units. David hesitated because he was just an intern, and who was he to have opinions? But Patricia encouraged him to speak free. Looked at the plans spread across the table. He pointed out that the bathroom layout seemed inefficient. There was a lot of wasted space in the plumbing walls. If they reconfigured the bathrooms and stacked the plumbing more efficiently, they could reduce costs and potentially add more square footage to the living areas. Patricia looked at him with raised eyebrows. She pulled out a calculator and started running numbers. After a few minutes, she looked up and smiled. David's suggestion could save about 8% on plumbing costs per unit. Multiply that across 200 apartments and it was significant money. She told David that was excellent thinking. Kenneth happened to be walking by and overheard the conversation. He came over and looked at what David had proposed. Then he called over to other engineers to review it. Within an hour, they had revised the plans to incorporate David's idea. Kenneth told David that he had just made a real contribution to a real project. This was not busy work. This was actual value. David felt like he was floating. Could not wait to tell his father. When David got home that evening, Carlos was just waking up to get ready for his night shift. Told him everything that had happened. He described the office and the people and how they had actually used his suggestion. Carlos listened with tears in his eyes. He told David that his mother would have been so proud. She had always believed David would do great things. Night, while Carlos was at work, David sat at the small kitchen table in their apartment and thought about how much had changed. Just a month ago, he had been preparing to give up on university. He's been resigned to taking whatever job he could find and maybe going to community college. He had a full scholarship and a position at one of the biggest companies in the city. He was working alongside experienced professionals who treated him like a colleague. It felt almost overwhelming. David pulled out his phone and looked at his class schedule for the fall semester. He had registered for advanced mathematics and physics and an introduction to sustainable architecture. The courses looked challenging, but he was ready more than ready. Over the next several months, David fell into a rhythm. He worked at Harrison Industries every Saturday, and some evenings after school, he maintained a straight A average at Lincoln High. He helped his father on Sunday nights with the cleaning routes, and slowly he started to build relationships with people at the company. Became something of a mentor to David. She taught him how to think like an engineer, how see problems from multiple angles and consider not just what was possible, but what was practical. She showed him that good design was about balancing competing priorities: cost versus quality, aesthetics versus function, innovation versus reliability. Kenneth also took an interest in David's development. He started inviting David to higher-level meetings where major decisions were made. He wanted David to see how business worked at the executive level. One day, Kenneth asked David if he had ever met with Robert Wanon. Since that first meeting, David said he had seen Robert a few times in the hallways, and they had exchanged greetings, but Robert was incredibly busy, running a massive company. Kenneth smiled and said that David should not assume Robert had forgotten about him. Robert was known for keeping track of people he cared about. Sure enough, the next week, David received an email from Robert's assistant. Robert wanted to have lunch with David on Friday. David spent the entire week nervous about it. What would they talk about? What if he said something stupid? Friday arrived. David put on his dress shirt and tie again. He met Robert at a quiet restaurant near the Harrison Industries building. Robert was already there waiting and stood up to shake David's hand when he arrived. They sat down, and Robert immediately put David at ease by asking casual questions about school and work. He wanted to know what David was learning and what he found most interesting. David relaxed and started talking naturally. He described the projects he was working on and the things Patricia and Kenneth were teaching him. He mentioned some ideas he had been thinking about for improving construction efficiency. Albert listened intently and asked thoughtful follow-up questions after. They had been talking for about 30 minutes. Robert leaned back in his chair. He told David that he had been getting excellent reports about his work. Everyone in the engineering department was impressed with his attitude and his contributions. Robert said he wanted to share something personal with David. When Robert was young, his family had struggled financially just like David's. Robert's father had worked long hours in a factory, and his mother had cleaned houses. They sacrificed everything to make sure Robert could get an education. Robert remembered feeling ashamed sometimes of where he came from. He remembered wanting to hide the fact that his clothes were secondhand and that he worked as a dishwasher to help pay for books, but his parents taught him that there was no shame in honest work. They taught him that character mattered more than circumstances. Those lessons had stayed with Robert throughout his entire career. Even when he became successful and wealthy, he never forgot where he came from. He never forgot what it felt like to struggle. That was why meeting David and Carlos had affected him so deeply. Watching David help his father without complaint, seeing the dignity with which they both approached their work, it reminded Robert of his own parents. It reminded him of why he had built his company in the first place. Not just to make money, but to create opportunities. Looked directly at David and said something that would stay with him forever. He said that David had a gift, not just intelligence, but something rarer. Ability to succeed without losing his humanity. The ability to care about others, even while pursuing his own goals. Robert had met many smart people in his life. Smart people without character often did more harm than good. David had both in. That combination was powerful. Told David that he saw tremendous potential in him, not just as an engineer, but as a leader, someone who could build things that mattered, someone who could make decisions that helped people over the next few years. Robert wanted to mentor David personally. He wanted to teach him not just about business, but about responsibility. Using success to lift others up, David felt overwhelmed by Robert's faith in him. He asked why Robert was investing so much time and attention in him. Specifically, Robert's answer was simple: because someone had done it for him once. When Robert was in college struggling to pay tuition, a professor had noticed his potential. That professor had helped Robert get a scholarship and an internship, had mentored him and opened doors. Robert's entire career had been built on that foundation of someone believing in him when he needed it most. Now, it was Robert's turn to do the same for someone else. And David reminded Robert so much of himself at that age, hungry to learn, willing to work, determined to make something of himself, but also kind and thoughtful and concerned about others. David felt tears forming in his eyes. He told Robert that he would work harder than anyone, that he would make the most of this opportunity, that he would never take it for granted. Robert smiled and said he already knew that. The fact that David felt such gratitude and responsibility showed exactly why he was the right person to invest in. As he finished lunch and prepared to leave, Robert mentioned one more thing: was creating a new program through the Harrison Foundation. Would be called the True Character Scholarship. It would provide full funding for children of Harrison Industries employees who demonstrated not just academic achievement, but strong moral character. David would be the first recipient, but Robert hoped there would be many more young people like him in the years to come. The program would look for students who showed integrity, when no one was watching, who helped others without expecting recognition, who worked hard and treated people with respect, regardless of their position. Basically, the program would look for people like David. Robert asked if David would be willing to help evaluate future applicants, to share his story and inspire other young people. David agreed immediately. That evening when David got home, he found his father already there. Carlos was sitting at the kitchen table looking at something. When David came in, Carlos looked up with a strange expression on his face. He slid a letter across the table. David picked it up and read it. It was from Harrison Industries' Human Resources Department. Carlos had been promoted to facility supervisor. His salary was nearly doubling. He would now oversee all the cleaning and maintenance staff for the entire building, and he would be working day shifts instead of nights. David looked at his father in shock. Carlos's hands were shaking slightly. He said he had been called into a meeting that morning with Linda from HR. She told him that Robert personally recommended the promotion. Robert had said that anyone who could raise a son like David while working night shifts for 12 years clearly had excellent management and leadership abilities. Would start his new position next month. He would have weekends off for the first time in over a decade. He would have health insurance and retirement benefits. David hugged his father tightly. Both of them cried. For years they had struggled and sacrificed and just tried to get by. Now, suddenly everything was changing. Their lives were transforming in ways they never could have imagined. Because one night a billionaire had pretended to sleep on a couch and a teenage boy had adjusted an air conditioner and protected a briefcase simply because it was the right thing to do that night. David lay in bed, unable to sleep. His mind was racing with everything that had happened: the scholarship, the internship, the mentorship with Robert, his father's promotion. It felt like a miracle, but David understood it was not really a miracle. It was the result of years of his father teaching him values, of working hard in school, years of treating people with kindness and respect. Those choices had been building toward something. Even when David did not know it, character was not something you turned on and off. Fit was who you were when it mattered, and when it did not matter. Robert had been testing him that night, but David had passed the test simply by being himself, by doing what his father had taught him to do, be treating others the way he would want to be treated. David made a promise to himself right then. He would never forget this feeling, the gratitude and the opportunity and the responsibility when he became successful, and he was determined to become successful. He would look for young people who reminded him of himself. He would give them chances. He would believe in them. He would pass forward what Robert was giving him, because that was how you changed the world, not by keeping good fortune to yourself, but by sharing it and multiplying it and creating opportunities for others. David finally fell asleep with a smile on his face. His future was bright, not just because of the scholarship or the job, but because he had learned what truly mattered in life, and he had met people who reinforced those lessons. People like Robert, who used wealth to create opportunity. People like his father, who showed dignity in every circumstance. People like Patricia and Kenneth, who shared knowledge generously. These were the people David wanted to surround himself with. These were the kind of person he wanted to become. He was well on his way. For years passed faster than David could have imagined. He was now 21 years old and in his final semester at the state university. The journey had not been easy despite the financial support. There were late nights studying for exams and challenging courses that pushed him to his limits. There were moments when he doubted himself and wondered if he really belonged among all these other talented students. But every time David felt overwhelmed, he remembered that night in Robert's office. He remembered the trust that had been placed in him. He remembered his father working 12 years without missing a day. And he pushed through. David had graduated at the top of his engineering class, had maintained a perfect grade point average, while also working part-time at Harrison Industries throughout all 4 years. The part-time work had evolved significantly by his junior year. David was no longer just an intern assistant. He was leading small projects and presenting ideas to senior management. Patricia had continued mentoring him and treating him almost like a younger colleague. Rather than a student, Kenneth had assigned him increasingly complex problems to solve, and Robert had met with David every few months for lunch. Those meetings had become something David treasured. Robert shared wisdom about business and leadership. In life, he told stories about his own struggles and failures. He was honest about mistakes he had made and lessons he had learned the hard way. Robert never pretended to have all the answers. Instead, he taught David how to think critically and make ethical decisions, even when they were difficult. One of the most valuable lessons came during David's sophomore year. He had been working on a project to design affordable apartment buildings. David had come up with an innovative approach that could reduce construction costs by almost 15%. He was excited to present it to the team, but when he showed his designs to Patricia, she pointed out a problem. David's cost savings came primarily from using cheaper materials and certain structural elements. The materials met the minimum legal requirements, but they were not as durable or safe as the standard materials Harrison Industries typically used. David could have argued that meeting legal minimums was enough. Many companies did exactly that, but Patricia asked him a simple question. Would you want your father living in a building constructed with these materials, David? Realized immediately that the answer was no, he went back and redesigned the project. It took 3 extra weeks and the cost savings were reduced to about 8%. But the final design was something David felt proud of, something he could stand behind completely when he presented the revised plans. Robert happened to be in the meeting afterward. Robert pulled David aside. He told him that watching David make that choice to prioritize safety over cost savings had been a defining moment. People in business faced that exact decision and chose profit. David had chosen integrity. Robert said that was exactly the kind of leader the world needed during his junior year. David faced a different kind of challenge. Large construction firm had contacted him directly, had heard about his work at Harrison Industries and wanted to recruit him. They offered him a summer internship that paid 3 times what he was making. They hinted that a full-time position after graduation could be his. Money was tempting even with the scholarship. David and his father still lived modestly. Carlos was doing much better as facilities supervisor, but they had years of debt to pay off. The extra money could help significantly. David went to Robert for advice. He explained the offer honestly. Robert listened carefully and then asked David what he wanted to do. David admitted he was torn. The money would help his father, but he felt loyalty to Harrison Industries and to Robert personally. Robert smiled and told David something surprising. He said David should take the offer. David looked shocked. Travert explained that loyalty was admirable, but David should not feel obligated to stay at Harrison Industries forever, though. Scholarship had been a gift with no strings attached. David owed Robert nothing except to become the best version of himself. If this other company could offer better opportunities, then David should explore that. Travert said he would be disappointed if David felt trapped by gratitude. Whole point was to give David freedom to build the life he wanted. David thought about it for several days. He met with the recruiters from the other company. They showed him their projects and talked about their vision. The work was impressive, but something felt off during the meetings. Everyone talked constantly about profit margins and shareholder value. Nobody mentioned the people who would actually live in the buildings they constructed. Nobody seemed to care about creating housing that working families could afford. They were focused entirely on luxury developments and maximum returns. David realized that money was not everything. Working for a company whose values did not align with his own would make him miserable no matter how much they paid. He declined their offer and stayed at Harrison Industries. When he told Robert about his decision, Robert did not say, "I told you so." He just nodded and said he was glad David had figured it out for himself. That was how you learned what truly mattered, not by someone telling you, but by experiencing it firsthand. By David's senior year, he had become an integral part of the Harrison Industries team. He was no longer considered an intern. He was a junior engineer working on major projects. One of those projects would change everything. Harrison Industries had acquired a large piece of land on the outskirts of the city. The plan was to develop it into a new residential community. The city desperately needed more affordable housing. Families were being priced out of the market by rising cost. Kenneth called a meeting with the entire engineering department. He explained that Robert wanted this project to be different, not just another development, but a model for how to create quality, affordable housing. He wanted to prove that developers could do well financially while also doing good for the community. Kenneth said the project needed a lead designer, someone who understood both the technical engineering aspects and the human elements, someone who cared about the people who would live there. He looked directly at David. David felt his heart skip. This was a massive project, millions of dollars in construction, hundreds of families would be affected, and Kenneth was suggesting that a 21-year-old college senior should lead the design. Kenneth must have seen the doubt on David's face. He said David would not be alone. Patricia would be the senior engineer overseeing everything, but Kenneth wanted David's vision to drive the design. He wanted fresh thinking, unconstrained by how things had always been done. David accepted the challenge. Over the next 6 months, he worked harder than he ever had in his life. He researched sustainable building materials and energy-efficient systems. He studied successful affordable housing projects from around the world. He talked to families about what they actually needed in a home, not just square footage and amenities, but practical things, storage space, and natural light and layouts that worked for real-life. David designed apartment units that were smaller than luxury condos, but felt spacious because of smart design. He incorporated shared community spaces that reduced costs while building a sense of neighborhood. He used modular construction techniques that cut building time and expenses. He selected materials that were durable and low maintenance. An entire project was designed around one principle: people deserved to live in homes they could be proud of, regardless of their income. When David presented his comprehensive plan to Robert and the executive team, he was nervous. This was not a small tweak to an existing project. This was his vision from the ground up. He stood in front of the conference room with his detailed models and renderings. He walked them through every decision and explained his reasoning. He finished. There was silence. David worried that meant they hated it. Then Robert started clapping. Everyone else in the room joined. Robert stood up and shook David's hand. Here said this was exactly what he had hoped for: innovative and practical and focused on people. Project was approved immediately. Construction would begin that summer, right after David graduated. Over the next few months, David split his time between finishing his final classes and working on the development project. He coordinated with contractors and suppliers. He solved problems as they arose during the building process. He made sure the construction stayed true to his design vision. His professors at the university noticed how engaged he was with real-world application. One of them asked David to give a guest lecture about the project. David talked to a classroom full of engineering students about designing with purpose, about remembering that buildings were not just structures but homes where people live their lives. Several students approached him afterward. They said his presentation had changed how they thought about their future careers. They wanted to work on projects that mattered. To David realized he was already passing forward what Robert had given him. He was inspiring others just by doing work he believed in. When graduation day arrived, David walked across the stage to receive his engineering degree. Carlos was in the audience, crying with pride. So was Robert, so were Patricia and Kenneth and Linda and many others from Harrison Industries who had become like family. David had achieved something remarkable. He was graduating with no debt. He had, for years of professional experience, he had led a major development project and he had maintained his character and values throughout. After the ceremony, Robert hosted a celebration dinner for David and Carlos. During the dinner, Robert made an announcement. He was offering David a full-time position as a project manager at Harrison Industries. David would oversee the completion of the affordable housing development. After that, he would lead the newly created community housing division, would focus exclusively on creating quality affordable housing, Robert said. He was investing $50 million into this initiative over the next 5 years. David would have the resources and authority to make a real impact. The salary Robert offered was generous, more than David had ever imagined making right out of college. But what mattered more was the opportunity. This was everything David had dreamed about: using his engineering skills to help families like his own, creating homes that people could afford without sacrificing quality or dignity. Accepted immediately, he gave a short speech thanking Robert for believing in him, thanking Carlos for sacrificing everything to give him opportunities, thanking Patricia and Kenneth and everyone else who had invested time in teaching him. He promised he would work every day to earn their faith in him. Robert smiled and said David had already earned it. The test had been passed years ago when David adjusted an air conditioner for a sleeping stranger. Everything since then had just confirmed what Robert knew from that first night. David Rivera was someone special, not because he was smarter than everyone else, though he was very smart, but because he combined intelligence with empathy, ambition with integrity. The drive to succeed with the desire to serve. Those combinations were they were exactly what the world needed. As the dinner wound down and people started to leave, David and Robert found themselves alone for a moment. David told Robert that he had been thinking a lot about that night 4 years ago. He had been so focused on helping his father that he almost had not noticed Robert on the couch. What if he had been in a bad mood that day? What if he had been careless or rushed? His entire life might be different. Norbert shook his head. He said David was wrong about that. Character was not something you turned on for special occasions. It was who you were consistently. If David had been the kind of person to be careless or rude, then he would not have been the kind of son who helped his father in the first place. Said he had not gotten lucky finding David. He had simply paid attention and recognized what was already there. Good people do good things, and good things happen. To good people, not always, and not immediately, but over time, character pays dividends. David had invested years in becoming a person of integrity. That investment was now paying returns, and would continue paying returns for the rest of his life. David understood what Robert meant. This was not about luck or chance. It was about choices. It made every day for years, choices his father had modeled for him, choices that had become habits, that had become character as David drove home that night. With his degree in hand and his future bright, he thought about all the young people out there like he had been smart, spat and hard-working, but without resources or connections. Struggling to see a path forward, David made a commitment to himself. He would look for those people. He would create opportunities for them. He would be to someone else what Robert had been to him, because that was how you changed the world, one person at a time, one opportunity at a time, one choice at a time. David smiled as he pulled into the parking lot of the apartment complex, where he and his father still lived. Soon they would move to something better, but this place held good memories. It reminded him of where he came from, and he never wanted to forget that, because remembering where you came from kept you humble, and humility combined with success was a powerful thing. David was ready for whatever came next. Had been prepared not just by his education, but by his experiences, by the people who had believed in him, by the values that had guided him, and most of all, by the simple act of doing the right thing when nobody was watching. That choice had changed his life, and now he would spend his life helping others make similar choices. That was his purpose. That was his calling, and he could not wait to begin. 2 years had passed since David graduated from university, was now 23 years old, and had accomplished more than most people twice his age. Affordable housing development he designed was complete. 300 families had moved into quality homes they could actually afford. The project had won awards from the city for innovative design and community impact. Local news outlets had featured stories about the development. They interviewed families who talked about how much their lives had improved. Single mothers who could finally afford rent and still have money left for their children. Elderly couples who had been struggling on fixed incomes. Young workers just starting their careers, all of them living in homes with modern amenities and energy-efficient systems and access to community spaces. David visited the development regularly. He walked through the courtyards and playgrounds he had designed. He saw children playing safely and neighbors talking on their porches. This was what he had imagined when he first sketched the plans. Just buildings, but a community. The success of the first project had led to more opportunities. Robert had approved funding for 3 additional developments in different parts of the city. David was overseeing all of them as head of the community housing division. His team had grown to include 12 engineers and designers. Many of them were young professionals who shared David's vision of using their skills to help people. David made sure to mentor them the way Patricia and Kenneth had mentored him. He remembered what it felt like to be young and uncertain, to have ideas but lack confidence, to want to make a difference but not know how. So he created an environment where his team members could take risks and learn from mistakes, where innovation was encouraged, and where the focus was always on the people they were serving. Afternoon, David received a call from Robert's assistant. Trabert wanted to see him in his office. David wondered what this was about. They still had their regular lunch meetings, but those were scheduled in advances. Seemed more urgent. When David arrived at Robert's office, he found the older man looking out the window at the city skyline. Robert turned and smiled when David entered. He invited him to sit down. Robert said he had been doing a lot of thinking lately. He was 68 years old now, and had been running Harrison Industries for over 3 decades. He loved his work, but he was also aware that he would not be doing it forever. Had been watching David closely over the past 2 years, watching how he led his team and managed complex projects and made decisions, watching how he handled success without becoming arrogant, how he treated everyone with respect, regardless of their position. Wilbert said that David reminded him so much of himself. At that age, hungry and driven, but also grounded in values, Robert wanted to discuss David's future. Community housing division was successful, but it was still relatively small compared to Harrison. Industries as a whole were believed affordable. Housing could become a much bigger part of the company's mission. He wanted to expand it dramatically over the next 5 years, but that would require the right leadership. Robert looked at David and asked if he would consider becoming vice president of community development. It would mean a significant promotion and much more responsibility. David would oversee not just housing, but also projects related to schools and healthcare facilities and other community infrastructure. He would have a budget of hundreds of millions of dollars, and he would report directly to Robert. David was stunned. He was only 23 years old. Most vice presidents at major companies were in their 40s or 50s. Robert seemed to read his thoughts. He said age did not matter. What mattered was vision and character and the ability to execute. David had proven he possessed all three. Robert also said he wanted to be transparent about his long-term thinking. Eventually, probably within the next 10 years, Robert would step down as head of Harrison Industries. When that happened, he wanted the company to be in hands he trusted, hands that would maintain the values he cared about. David was being groomed for leadership at the highest level. This promotion was the next step in that journey. David took a deep breath. He told Robert honestly that he felt overwhelmed by the faith being placed in him, but he also felt ready. The past 6 years had prepared him for exactly this kind of responsibility. He accepted the position. Robert stood and shook his hand firmly. He said he knew David would excel over the next several months. David adjusted to his new role. The scope of his work expanded dramatically. He was now in meetings with city officials and urban planners and community leaders. He was making decisions that affected thousands of people. He hired additional staff and built out his division. One of his first initiatives was creating an internship program specifically for students from low-income backgrounds. David remembered being that kid who needed a chance. Now he could provide those chances to others. The program partnered with local high schools and community colleges. Students would work part-time at Harrison Industries while pursuing their education. They would get real-world experience and mentorship and exposure to career possibilities they might never have considered. The program was modeled directly on David's own experience. He even insisted on the same condition Robert had given him. Scholarship recipients had to promise to help others. Once they became successful, they had to pass it forward. The first group of interns started that fall. One students from various backgrounds. David met with each of them personally. He shared his own story, how he had been a janitor's son cleaning office buildings at night, how a billionaire had pretended to sleep, and watched him, how one act of simple decency had changed everything. Students listened with wide eyes. Some of them were skeptical. They asked if this was really true or just some inspirational story the company made up. David laughed and called his father. Carlos still worked at Harrison Industries' facilities supervisor. David put the call on speaker and asked his father to tell the students about that night 6 years ago. Carlos shared his perspective, how nervous he had been when he realized his boss was sleeping in the waiting area, how proud he was when he saw David being thoughtful and careful, how shocked they both were when Robert revealed he had been awake the whole time. The students believed it. Then this was not some corporate fairy tale. This was real land. It meant that their own choices mattered, that someone was watching and paying attention. That character could open doors. David told them he would be watching them the same way Robert had watched him, not to catch them doing something wrong, but to catch them doing something right. He wanted to find the students who demonstrated integrity when it was difficult, who helped others without seeking recognition, who worked hard and stayed humble. Those students would receive additional opportunities and mentorship. David kept his promise over the following months. He observed the interns carefully. He noticed which ones showed up early and stayed late, which ones helped their teammates without being asked, which ones treated the security guards and custodial staff with the same respect they showed executives. One student in particular caught his attention. Her name was Keisha Williams, and she was 18 years old. She came from a neighborhood where poverty and violence were common, but she was determined to create a different life for herself. Keisha was studying computer science at the community college while working part-time in David's division. She was quiet and serious and incredibly focused. David noticed that Keisha always volunteered for the difficult assignments. She never complained when projects ran long or deadlines. Got tight, she asked thoughtful questions and implemented feedback immediately, but what really impressed David was something he observed by accident. One evening he was working late and saw Keisha in the break room. She was helping one of the custodians who was struggling to fix a broken coffee machine. The custodian was an elderly man who did not speak English very well. Keisha was patient and kind. She used her phone to translate, and together they figured out the problem. The custodian thanked her profusely. Keisha just smiled and said it was no problem. She did not know David was watching from down the hall. The next week, David called Keisha into his office. She looked nervous, like she thought she was in trouble. David told her to relax. He wanted to talk to her about her future plans. Keisha said she hoped to transfer to a 4-year university after finishing her associate degree, but she was not sure if she could afford it, even with financial aid. David asked if she had heard about the True Character Scholarship. It was the program Robert had created based on David's experience. Keisha said she knew about it, but assumed she did not qualify. She had good grades, but not perfect ones. David explained that the scholarship was not just about grades, it was about character, about being the kind of person who helped others and worked hard and maintained integrity. He told Keisha about seeing her help the custodian, how that small act of kindness revealed something important about who she was. David said he was nominating her for the scholarship. If she was selected, it would cover her full tuition and living expenses at the state university. Keisha started crying. She told David that she had been working 2 jobs to save money for school, that she was exhausted and sometimes wondered if she could keep going. This scholarship would change everything. David told her that she deserved it, that her hard work and character had earned it, just like his own hard work had earned his opportunity 6 years ago. Keisha received the scholarship. She transferred to the university the following year, and David made sure to stay in touch with her to mentor her the way Robert had mentored him. This became a pattern. David found young people with potential and created opportunities for them. Some became engineers on his team, others went into different fields, carried forward the lessons about integrity and service. The impact multiplied. Those students graduated and went on to help others. They started their own initiatives and programs. They became teachers and social workers and entrepreneurs and community leaders, all of them committed to using their success to lift others up. 3 years after becoming vice president, David attended the opening ceremony for his 5th affordable housing development. This one was special because it included not just apartments, but also a community center and a job training facility. Had designed it based on feedback from residents of his earlier projects. They said housing was important, but people also needed skills and support to improve their economic situations. So David created a comprehensive approach: affordable homes plus education, plus job training, plus childcare, plus healthcare access. Everything working together to help families build better lives. The ceremony, David gave a speech. He talked about how none of this would exist if not for a chain of people helping people. His father, who sacrificed everything and taught him values; Robert, who saw potential and provided opportunity; Patricia and Kenneth, who shared their knowledge; and now hundreds of others who were part of this mission. David said that affordable housing was not charity. It's investment in human potential. When you gave people stable housing, they could focus on other things: education building, careers raising, healthy children, contributing to their communities. The returns on that investment were enormous. Not just financial, though. The projects were profitable, but social returns: stronger neighborhoods, reduced poverty, more opportunity, better futures for the next generation. As David spoke, he looked out at the audience. He saw Robert sitting in the front row with Carlos beside him. Both of them had tears in their eyes. He saw Keisha, who was now a sophomore at the university. He saw his team members who worked tirelessly on these projects. He saw the families who would move into these new homes, and he felt overwhelming gratitude. 6 years ago, he had been a teenager helping his father clean office buildings, worrying about how to pay for college, wondering if he would ever get a real chance. Now he was standing here as a vice president of a major company, leading projects that affected thousands of lives, mentoring the next generation of leaders, all because he had done one simple thing. He had been kind to a stranger. He had adjusted an air conditioner and protected a briefcase. He had shown basic human decency. That was the lesson. David wanted everyone to understand character matters not. It's just in big dramatic moments, but in small everyday choices. How you treat people when no one is watching, how you handle responsibility when it is given to you, how you use success when you achieve it. Those things define who you really are, and they determine what kind of impact you have on the world. After the ceremony, Robert pulled David aside. He said he had one more surprise. Harrison Industries was creating a new foundation. It would be called the Rivera Foundation in honor of David and Carlos. The foundation would have an endowment of $100 million. Its mission would be to identify and support young people from disadvantaged backgrounds who demonstrated strong character. It would provide scholarships and mentorship and career opportunities. David would serve as president of the foundation here and have the resources to help thousands of young people over the coming decades to create for them what Robert had created for him. David was speechless. Robert smiled and said, "This was always the plan from that very first night, when he watched David adjust the air conditioner. Had known David was special, someone who would not just use opportunity for himself, but would multiply it for others." Foundation was the next phase, a way to institutionalize and expand what had started with one scholarship for one young man. David hugged Robert. He told him he did not have words adequate to express his gratitude. Robert said no words were necessary, just results, just continuing to be the person David already was, continuing to help others, continuing to prove that character and success could coexist. That was enough that night. David sat with his father in their new apartment. They had moved to a much nicer place, but Carlos had insisted it not be too fancy. He said he never wanted to forget where they came from. David told his father about the foundation, about the $100 million endowment, about the opportunity to help thousands of young people. Carlos shook his head in amazement. He said when he used to push that cleaning cart through Harrison Industries late at night, he never imagined anything like this. He had just been trying to provide for his son, to teach him right from wrong, to show him that honest work had dignity. David told his father that those lessons were worth more than any amount of money they had shaped who David became. They had made everything else possible. Carlos smiled and said David's mother would be so proud. She had always believed their son would do important things. David felt tears forming. He wished his mother could see what her sacrifice and love had contributed to how her values lived on through him, through the work he did, through the people he helped, through the legacy that would continue long after he was gone. As David lay in bed that night, he thought about the journey from janitor's son to vice president, from struggling student to foundation president, from wondering how to afford college to having resources to send thousands of others to college. It seemed impossible, but it had happened one choice at a time, one act of integrity at a time, one opportunity passed forward at a time, and it would keep happening because David understood something fundamental. Success was not a destination. It was a responsibility. It's a chance to make the world a little bit better, to help people who were where you used to be, to prove that circumstances do not determine destiny, character does. That was the truth Robert had seen 6 years ago when he pretended to sleep on a couch. That was the truth that had changed David's life, and that was the truth David would spend the rest of his life proving to others, not through words but through actions, through the homes he built and the scholarships he provided and the young people he mentored, through being the person someone else needed. The way Robert had been that person for him, this was his purpose, this was his calling, and he would pursue it with everything he had, because somewhere out there right now was another teenager working hard and doing the right thing when no one was watching, wondering if they would ever get a chance, and David was going to make sure they did.